Hello, and welcome to I Know Dino, the Big Dinosaur Podcast, where we cover news, interviews, and discussions of all things dinosaur.
Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today's episode is brought to you by TRX Dinosaurs. They have innovative puppets, posable sculptures, and animatronics. And you can find out more at trxdinosaurs.com. This week, we have an interview with Dr. Andrew Farke and Gabriel-Philip Santos, both from the Alf Museum / Webb Schools. We have Dinosaur of the Day, Gojirasaurus, and we have a bunch of dinosaur news.
Surprise!
Yep.
It's so different every time.
It really is. One other very different thing is we're going to thank our Stegosaurus patrons. This week, we'd like to thank Chris, Nicholas, Blaze Campbell, Trent Carbajal, Paralor Lofus, Stefan, and Nutmeg. And Nutmeg just joined, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks to all of our patrons at the Stegosaurus level and at all of the levels. And if you want to join this growing group of amazing people, check out our page at patreon.com/iknowdino.
Jumping right into the news, first we have a new article from the International Journal of Speleology.
Whoa.
Which is like spelunking.
Really?
Meaning caves. Yeah.
That's cool.
So it's a journal about caves. And it was written by Jean-David Moreau and others. And what they did was they discovered some new dinosaur tracks in southern France that were in a cave, not surprisingly. Originally, they weren't in a cave. They were in a marsh. And then somehow through geological magic, they ended up inside a cave after getting shoved down and back up and all around. And it's a natural cave, which is kind of unusual because generally when we find footprints from dinosaurs and they're in a cave, it's from mining or tunneling. Like they recently found some fossils while tunneling the new subway for Los Angeles. And they often find them, for instance, in like opal mines in Australia or other sorts of mines around the US and Africa and things like that. But this is just in a natural cave. And most of the prints are actually on the ceiling, which is pretty weird. I mean, if it isn't weird enough to have dinosaur footprints in a cave. They found a total of 26 tracks, and mostly they're tridactyl prints. And a lot of them are eubrontes, which is that state fossil of, I think, Massachusetts and Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken. It's the three-toed print that's just ubiquitous all over the place. And it's likely a Dilophosaurus or something similar to a Dilophosaurus. Gives you kind of an idea about the size, 18 feet long. I'm talking the real Dilophosaurus, not the Jurassic World and Jurassic Park Dilophosaurus with the frill that spits venom. Actually, I don't know. I don't think that was in Jurassic World, was it?
No, Jurassic Park.
Just Jurassic Park. Yeah, so this guy was actually much longer, more like Allosaurus type size, or a little smaller. They have some really awesome pictures in the article of them holding a flashlight in the cave next to the print. And it really makes the print stand out when you hold a flashlight at an angle. You can get a good view of it. But it also reminded me of a bunch of horror movies. And then I tried to look up which horror movie had the monsters in it where the people got stuck in it. And there were so many results that I couldn't tell which one was the one that I had seen. There's literally a movie about people getting trapped in a cave with monsters almost every year. And a lot of them are called like The Cave or like The Depths or The Stuck in a Cave or like Cave Nightmare or whatever.
Wow, popular topic.
It is. The one of them was like lampreys attacking people, and then there was like a huge lamprey.
Oh, jeez.
And then sometimes it's, you know, more anthropomorphic things and everything else in between. So anywho, if I saw this footprint in a cave, I'd probably freak out.
Yeah.
Although on the ceiling, I might freak out less because that makes it seem like it's not something that was walking there recently.
Oh, true. Also, you might not be looking up.
True, for footprints. We got a couple more footprint pieces of news. They're all very different, though. The next one comes out of Cretaceous research, and it was written by Lita Xing and others. And so they're in China, about halfway in between Beijing and Shanghai, pretty much exactly if you drew a line between the two and went right in the middle. They found about 40 tracks. They include sauropods, large theropods, and ornithopods. And they're in at least 10 different stratigraphic levels. And stratigraphic levels are like the layer cake of geology. But in this case, it's been stuck up out of the ground and then like turned 90 degrees. So it's like if you took a piece of cake, like it was in a cake, and then you cut it and then you lay it down on its side. That's kind of how the stratigraphy is. It's like lined up 90 degrees to the ground. And then it's also sticking up really high too. It's basically like a cliff face. So yeah, they had to use a drone to take pictures of it because they couldn't climb on it or see them all from the ground. But unfortunately, they didn't do full photogrammetry of the pictures. They just used regular photographs on a drone to kind of get a general picture of what they look like and try to kind of do some analysis about what type of footprints they are. Like you can tell if it's a sauropod because it's a big circle. If it's a theropod, you're looking for the 3 toes, etc. They think that it was on an ancient floodplain that occasionally dried out, and that's really what the fossils look like. It has that characteristic, like cracked earth look to it, but I guess it fossilized like that. It's really cool looking. And then you can really clearly see these footprints in it, which have darker sediment. At first, I was looking at the picture for the footprints, and I was looking for something really subtle because a lot of times the footprints are barely there and they're a real slight relief kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But in this one, it was super obvious because it's a dark brown footprint with this light cracked surface around it. So it's really easy to pick them out. Looks really neat. And it's always cool to see multiple different types of dinosaur there too, like sauropods and theropods and ornithopods. And on our third continent of the episode, we're in the U.S. for the last set of dinosaur tracks. It was published in PLOS 1 by Brian Platt and others. And in this case, they freshly digitized some tracks. It's not a new set of tracks, although it is new to me. I had never heard of these. And in this case, it was in a commercial quarry. More common, like I said, than finding things in a cave that's naturally occurring. But since it's a quarry, it's more of an open pit kind of thing. So they're open to all the elements. And they discovered them in 1983, or at least some of them. And it was hundreds of sauropod tracks in the first paper that was published then. They're all in southwest Arkansas in an area called the DeQueen Limestone Formation in Howard County, which is pretty close to Mississippi and Louisiana over there. And then almost 30 years later, in 2011, a different group discovered about 30 theropod tracks right nearby, basically in the same area. It's technically separated a little bit, but it's to anybody looking at it now, it's just the same place effectively. They believe that the theropod that left the tracks is Acrocanthosaurus, and there are 2 sets of tracks that are over 30 meters or 100 feet long, although they're walking in exactly opposite directions. So they're parallel, but one set's going, like northwest, the other one's going southeast. So that's kind of interesting. And they also cross kind of obliquely with the sauropod tracks, so possibly not laid down at the same time. Just kind of a coincidence. Mm-hmm. This new article in 2018 looked to kind of map the entire area, and I think when they did that, they also found some new additional theropod prints in with the sauropods. I'm not positive because it's a little bit vague about which site was which, and I didn't closely read all dozens of pages of all these articles. Just enough to get all the most interesting information. So one of my favorite things is they have this big picture of the whole site. And in the caption, they wrote, "Pickup truck for scale."
Oh, gosh.
And the pickup is this tiny little thing in the corner, basically. So it's really a massive site, as you'd expect from hundreds of sauropod tracks and, tens of theropod tracks in the mix, too. But the researchers also managed to map the entire area with LiDAR. And to do that, they used a boom lift and a ZNF Imager 5006i laser scanner, which I had to read about because that sounds exciting. Basically, this laser scanner is a LiDAR scanner, and it can scan between 0.4 meters and 79 meters away, or 15 inches to 3,000 inches. It's kind of a weird distance to use inches for.
Yeah, it's a very wide range.
Yeah, more like 200 something feet. But anyway, It can also scan 508,000 points per second. If you're familiar with LiDAR, it measures individual points over and over again to kind of get a map of the area, but just with individual points, sort of like a really pixelated picture. And it has sub-millimeter precision. So when it does that mapping, it's very precise, which is obviously useful if you're worried about things like depths of tracks in a trackway.
Mm-hmm.
Just as an aside, the successor to the scanner can do over 1 million points a second. It's pretty impressive.
That is.
You can pick up a used one of these only 500,000 points a second for about $25,000. I have no use for it, but I had to see how expensive they were because it sounds so cool. And then the researchers combined all of this LiDAR data with pictures that they took from the same boom lift, and they created a map of the entire area. And it reminds me a lot of the trackway in Picket Wire that we talked about with Bruce Schumacher, which is in Colorado, and just like how many sauropods they are and how it's a little bit broken up, but there's so much going on. And you look at this picture and you're like, holy cow, how many dinosaurs and how many theropods were there at that time. It's crazy. Long story short, though, this is something really exciting to do if you're ever in Southwest Arkansas, would be to go to this spot. I couldn't find if the quarry is still active or not. They did mention that they were a little bit worried about people poaching, so that was one of the reasons that they wanted to do the LiDAR scan, and they also did a lot of impressions using actual plaster and silicone and stuff like that. So I'm guessing it's easy enough to get to. I'm not sure if you have to trespass to do it or not, though, because obviously if you're stealing things, that's probably not your number one concern.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it's open to the public, though. That'd be really cool to see.
Yeah, it sounds like a really cool project.
Mm-hmm. And next we got an email from Steve with a couple interesting comments that we wanted to talk about. His first one, he said, quote, Deinonychus have both a large toe claw as well as feathered arms. While feathered arms are not capable of obtaining any level of flight, they would have been useful in maintaining balance as it climbed up onto its prey and used its weight to tear through its next meal. Making those rear claws useful as a weapon would surely put it off balance during a fight, and the wind resistance of the feathered arms would work well to help counter the efforts to be thrown off in the heat of battle. It's a pretty interesting idea. And we've talked before about how wings are definitely useful for more than just flight, especially in the early stages of dinosaur evolution.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about both the ground up, which is wing-assisted incline running or wear, basically allowing animals to run up steeper slopes because they can use their wings to sort of push themselves up a little bit, as well as the trees down where you could glide a little bit and potentially jump a little bit farther in between branches. They're also obviously useful for display if you're attracting mates like a peacock, or in intimidation like owls and some other animals do. They kind of puff out their wings and start making just terrifying noises. Swans also do that.
Yep.
And
a lot of birds.
Speaking of swans, they can be used as weapons for like bludgeoning like swans do. And I guess it makes sense that you would add to the list balance, because it does make a lot of sense that if you're standing on one foot, being able to use wings, kind of like how people flail their arms a little bit to adjust your center of gravity. If you could actually push against something, kind of like pressing up against a wall to keep your balance, if you had a wing and you could just press up against the air, that would definitely help. So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's obviously really hard to test because it's hard to create a velociraptor and watch it attack something and see how it uses its wings.
True.
You might be able to see something similar. I don't know, though. Every animal I can think of that has wings that eats large animals, they tend to grab it and fly off with it.
What about something like a cassowary or an ostrich that could kick?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that, I suppose. And if they puff out their wings. Yeah, speaking of using wings for intimidation, ostriches definitely do that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They like puff them out and run around and start making terrible noises. Yeah, I suppose you could probably see it with an ostrich. It's a good point. Using a land-based animal would make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking with eagles and things that I've seen attack fairly large prey, they still always try to fly off with it, or they just kill it instantaneously, like digging the claws in and then eat it, which maybe a velociraptor could do something like that too. Kind of surprise it, kill it right away with its claws. I don't know.
Me either.
Yeah. It also kind of supposes that Deinonychus and Velociraptor and those types would attack something so large, which is pretty speculative. We tend to think of Deinonychosaurs as attacking smaller animals. Like they're more likely to attack something smaller than it than something big, because they're not crazy like cats.
Yeah. Unless the big thing is really injured already.
Yeah, I suppose.
Opportunistic.
Or if they're really desperate, sometimes animals will do stuff too. Steve also mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing, that ankylosaurs might end up preserved upside down in water so often because they might be using water as a sort of barrier to prevent animals from running around them. So, like, I'm imagining Bowser in that N64 game where you had to go grab its tail. And so you're, like, trying to spin around it and you can't turn fast enough. And, like, an ankylosaur doing the same thing. Although, I guess in reverse because it's trying to keep you by its tail.
Oh, Bowser does kind of look like an ankylosaur.
A little bit. It's got the spiky shell and everything. Yeah. So, I tried to think of a modern comparison to an ankylosaur because that's usually the first place to start with all this sort of animal behavior. And there isn't any good modern comparison to ankylosaurs. There just isn't anything alive today that has the combination of armor and camouflage and a weapon. We have things that are armored, but they're so big that they don't have any predators, like tortoises and things, where they're armored and they just live forever because nothing ever really attacks them. And then you have animals that are covered in weapons, basically like a porcupine. And that's really the closest thing I can think of to an ankylosaur in likely behavior. So porcupines do have several predators. I had to look this up. Actually, quite a few predators. The most common predator is an animal called a fisher, just like a fisherman, spelled the same way, which is a weasel-like carnivore. To me, it's pretty indistinguishable from a weasel or a ferret, but I'm sure an expert knows a lot of differences and would be insulted by this. Also, wolverines, coyotes, bears, cougars, eagles, and owls all on occasion eat porcupines. It's a pretty long list of animals.
Oh, didn't realize.
Yeah. Most of these are small and quick animals with the exception of bears, but bears are big and dumb and just kind of, they go after like bees and stuff too and just don't seem to care. So maybe there's sort of an exception. But all the other animals are pretty small and quick, and they basically all kill porcupines by attacking the face, because that's the one part of the porcupine that isn't covered in quills, essentially. So it might work to kill an ankylosaur by attacking its face, but ankylosaurs, unlike porcupines, do have a lot of defense on their face. They famously even have armored eyelids, as well as the bony plates all over their head and neck. So that might not be as good of an approach with ankylosaurs as it is with porcupines. On top of that, the same combination of speed and sharp teeth or whatever you need to attack usually leads to a small size with porcupines. So most of those animals are kind of similar in size, but with an ankylosaur, since it's so armored, I don't think an animal of similar size could actually take it down. You'd need something really big to be able to sort of crush through its armor, more like a T-Rex or something with just a lot of biting force. And as far as quick animals, the only one I could come up with was an Asdarkid, which are those big flying pterosaurs that have really powerful beaks. I was thinking maybe that could kind of surprise it and land on its back or something and get at its neck or its face, or I don't know. But then again, they might have just been more like tortoises, and unless it got flipped over, it was just invulnerable. It's kind of hard to say. So it might be reasonable to try to stay away from terrestrial predators by keeping your face closer to some sort of obstacle, and then your tail would be, you wouldn't have to rotate as far and it'd be harder for them to sneak around you. But that wouldn't only work with water, it would also work with steep hills because it's hard to climb uphill quickly. It would probably also work with large rocks and other obstacles.
It's kind of the same barriers humans would use if you think about where old forts and castles have been built.
Yeah, exactly.
On top of big hills.
Yeah.
Lots of rocks.
Exactly. Yeah. And a moat.
Yeah.
Steve is arguing for the moat principle. So it might be possible. It's really hard to say. Again, super speculative, hard to test. Unfortunately, there were a few really large animals that were armored and had tail weapons until recently, like glyptodonts, and there are also these tortoise-looking things, but those tortoise-looking guys went extinct about 3,000 years ago when people wiped them out, so we don't have any good modern analogs to compare to.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve, for the questions. We always like getting questions from our listeners. And if you are a listener with a question, then feel free to send it our way at plesiosaur@iknowdino.com.
Or on Facebook or Twitter or
Patreon,
Instagram, wherever.
Yeah, anywhere we are.
Yep.
Next, the George S. Eccles Dinosaur Park in Ogden, Utah has reopened, and I hope I pronounced all of that correctly. But anyway, it's been closed for a couple weeks for renovations and the installation of a new permanent exhibit. So Josh Cotton actually is a paleo artist with Dinosaur Park, so that's really cool. You might remember him from one of our much earlier episodes. We had him on the show and talking about his work. So the museum got new material from a traveling exhibit created by Western Paleontological Laboratories that it was retiring. And it includes 8 new types of dinosaurs and a lot of Jurassic era fossils. And there is, quote, more armor and more teeth, end quote, according to the education director, Jeff Bond. And there's also skeletons of Ceratosaurus and Tanicolagrius fighting. And the museum's been steadily growing. Now they're focusing on teaching people how paleontology works, and they also have a working fossil lab, which they use to assist the University of Utah. They called it kind of a satellite lab, which is pretty cool. Next, the paleontologist Denver Fowler from the Dickinson Museum Center is working on a new dinosaur exhibit called Claws. And recently he held a public sneak preview of these custom-made models that were made by the Serbian paleo artist Boban Filpovic, who made 3 fossil species with feathers of dinosaurs that lived in North Dakota in the Cretaceous. And the dinosaurs are based on research by Denver Fowler and Liz Friedman Fowler, and the exhibit is about how dinosaurs use their claws and the different types of claws that they had. So one model is of a velociraptor, and that'll be shown killing a small mammal called Didelphodon, and the second dinosaur doesn't yet have a name. There's not enough fossils found. Common story. Fowler is working on the exhibit this winter, and more details will be announced this spring. It sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. And there's an example of Velociraptor killing something tiny, like a little mammal,
Yes.
rather than trying to attack, say, Triceratops or something.
Yeah, good point. Speaking of that small mammal, Didelphodon. So Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta has a new exhibit called Cretaceous Lands, and they have 3 fossil casts. 2 are of dinosaurs, Nanotyrannus and Triceratops, and 1 is of Didelphodon, which is a small mammal. It's also a marsupial. In other news, McDonald's got in a little bit of trouble recently. In British Columbia, Canada, McDonald's released a radio ad that suggested that it was better to spend $5 on a McDonald's meal than to spend $5 on a museum tour. Oops. And in the commercial, there was a male narrator who said, you could get a museum tour for $5. And then a woman cuts in and says, there were dinosaurs, and then there weren't. Okay, then, exit through the gift shop.
I think that's a pretty good joke. It really is.
Well, and then the man tells listeners that they could spend $5 on a value meal. So there were a lot of people who were upset. I guess they didn't think it was a good joke.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand if you're constantly trying to encourage people to go to a museum and then an ad like this comes out and is basically discouraging people to go through a museum.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I don't think anyone's actually making this decision. Like, should I go to McDonald's and spend $5 on food, or should I go to a museum? It's not, those aren't substitutable quantities. You know what I mean?
Well, nobody agreed with you, unfortunately. Well,
I'm sure people
maybe
did.
Fortunately. Well, what happened is there's a lot of people who were affiliated with museums who reached out to complain. And then one day later, after the ad first aired, McDonald's pulled the ad. So they listened, and they said that the ad was meant to be humorous and not offensive to museums. And there's one spokesperson who said, quote, we apologize for any offense. We appreciate that museums are trusted, respected, and informative places about Canadian culture, and we are removing this ad from the airwaves immediately.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that is a pretty humorous and accurate way to describe dinosaurs. Like, they were around and then they weren't.
I can see, though, that if that's your work,
yeah,
it does come across as offensive.
If somebody summarized our podcast like that, I'd find it funny, though.
I see what you're saying, but I guess we're on opposite ends here.
I guess so.
In Ireland, Jim and Nobby from the Strawberry Alarm Clock Breakfast Show pranked one of their coworkers with Pete, who's this realistic dinosaur from the Dinosaurs Around the World show, which is currently in the Ambassador Theater near them. And Pete is a theropod, looks like probably Velociraptor or Velociraptor-ish, and Pete's a puppet. So somebody's in the suit, but it's large. It's bigger than most people. And they had Pete chase their female coworker around in an empty parking garage. And of course she's screaming and then everybody's laughing at the end. It reminds me of a really similar prank by a couple Australian radio show hosts. I think that happened around a year ago and we talked about it.
Yeah, they also did that with Chris Pratt at one point in the hallway around Jurassic World.
Guess it doesn't get old.
No. People like to scare people.
With dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Next, in the UK, a dinosaur toy was found on the M1 motorway between the junctions for Northampton and Coventry. And it was found when traffic officers were helping a driver change a tire, and they happened to notice this little dinosaur toy on the road. And Highways England officers tweeted about the toy because they're hoping to find the owners. And they said, quote, "Traffic officers are looking after it for you," end quote. And there's no word yet on whose dinosaur it is. I don't know if the owner did see it. I hope they did, because that's a pretty sweet story.
Yeah. Yeah, kids love throwing stuff out windows. I used to throw stuff out the window all the time when I was a kid.
Oh.
We lost so many, like, individual shoes. Like, we would get to where we were going and we'd only have one shoe. And we'd be like, what happened to the other shoe? Like, oops.
That makes no sense. Why did you do that?
I don't know. It's just fun to put stuff out the window.
Your toys, too?
I don't know if I threw a toy out the window. Maybe not. Yeah, kids can't be trusted with nice things. They'll destroy them or throw them away.
Oh, jeez.
Or at least I would.
And last in the news, Rich Douglas, who's a video game composer, has released a cinematic tribute to the Nintendo 64 game Turok Dinosaur Hunter. And it was originally composed by Darren Mitchell. So this is a soundtrack re-recording with 7 tracks, and the tracks have been updated to sound more like what you would hear in an action film.
Interesting. I do not remember the music being a highlight of Turok. But
apparently it was.
Maybe, yeah. Although I think N64 still used pretty simple sound. So maybe it, didn't have quite the fidelity that I would expect. Before we get into our interview, we'd like to pause to thank our sponsor, TRX Dinosaurs. And as a reminder, they have all sorts of things to serve your dinosaur-loving needs, be that a puppet of any dinosaur you could possibly imagine, or a posable sculpture.
A scientifically accurate one.
Yes, for your museum or for your office or house. And they can also make animatronics, if you're interested in that kind of thing. Say an interactive sort of display where they might be marching around or doing other fun dinosaur stuff.
Yeah. And they do really good work with feathers.
Yes. So if you're interested in getting any type of dinosaur puppet or sculpture or animatronic, head over to trxdinosaurs.com and enter what you're looking for, and they will custom make you a dinosaur of your own.
You can also follow them on Instagram at TRX Dinosaurs to see works in progress.
And now we're going to move on to our interview with Dr. Andrew Farke and Gabriel-Philip Santos.
Today, we get to chat with Dr. Andrew Farke and Gabriel-Philip Santos from the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology. And Andy is a paleontologist and Augustyn family curator and the director of research and collections. Andy's on the science faculty for the Webb Schools, which the Alf Museum is on the Webb Schools campus, and it's the only nationally accredited museum in the U.S. on a high school campus. And he's also a PLOS Paleo Community Editor. His research focuses on Cretaceous ecosystems in North America, especially ceratopsians. And Gabe is the collections manager at the museum, where he catalogs, organizes, and cares for the museum's growing collection of fossils. And he works on a number of insanely cool projects, which we'll be talking about. But to give you a hint, it involves social media, cosplay videos, and much more. So Gabe's research focuses on marine mammals. So how did you both get involved with the Alf Museum?
Well, I started at the Alf Museum way back in 2008, and I hadn't really heard of the institution before I applied for the job. I was finishing up grad school, looking for positions, and saw an advertisement for a curator opening at a museum that was on a high school campus. And I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And as I learned more and more about it, I thought, oh, wow, that's totally cool. And, almost 10 years later, here I am.
Wow.
That's exactly what we thought when we found out that there was a museum on a high school campus.
Well, it's funny for me. I'm from Southern California. I was born and raised not that far from here. But I actually had never heard of the Alf Museum either until I was in just starting in my master's program at Cal State Fullerton when I had decided to become a paleontologist. Mm-hmm. And that's when I first met Andy, I think, when one of the previous employees here, Peter Klaus, started at the grad program too. And that's when I found out about the museum. But when I was going through my master's program, I was looking for a new job from my previous museum. And it just so happened the collections manager position opened up here. And, everyone's all like, yeah, you should totally go for it. And I was like, I don't know. I don't have much experience. But everyone's like, you should totally do it. Even Andy was like, are you going to do it? And I was like, yeah. So I submitted my application and then I got the job.
Nice. So you had worked with Andy before?
Not worked, but we've met each other before.
Yeah, it's a small world in paleontology, and it's an even smaller world in Southern California paleontology. Yeah. So it's really hard to escape. And, Gabe, I'd seen him at conferences and meetings and stuff, and, had hung out a little bit. So, yeah, it's been exciting now to have him as a colleague here at the museum.
I'm forever grateful.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess paleontology is one of those things where oddly, there's not that many people in California doing it. You go to somewhere like Montana and it's jam-packed.
Well, actually, we are kind of jam-packed here. It's just, not everyone does dinosaurs.
Oh, true, yeah.
So, we're a little biased, sorry.
Everyone hears about. I would say one of the cool things about what's happening right now in Southern California is it's probably one of the best places in the U.S. for sure to be a paleontologist. We're close to some really cool historic field localities. We have everything from the Miocene-aged Barstow Formation to the La Brea tar pits. And then we have all these universities and museums that are, have, great traditions of paleontology and have hired on a bunch of really exciting people. Just where I'm at in Claremont, I think there's something like a half dozen vertebrate paleontologists that live within a 2-mile radius of my house.
Wow.
So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm from Orange County, and I'm one of the first generations to go through the Cal State Fullerton vertebrate paleontology program, and it's just really cool getting to meet all these new and up and coming paleontologists in the area, and from UCLA, USC. There's just a lot of us that you really wouldn't expect. And I think it's also because here in Southern California we have the rare occurrence of a lot of mitigation paleontology, and because LA and Orange County is just always growing. There's just new fossils coming out from everywhere, whether it's a brand new subway station or something or a freeway.
Good point.
Coming out of the ground all the time.
Yeah, construction is one of those things where it's like it might destroy fossils, but otherwise you might not know they were there. So you get like half of a fossil a lot of the times, it seems like.
Yeah.
So can you tell us some of the ways that you work with students? Because it's just really awesome that this museum is with a high school.
Yeah, so I guess probably Gabe and I can both speak to that. I'll maybe start just with kind of the more academic side of things. Just a little bit about the school. It's called the Webb Schools. It is a high school, 9 through 12 boarding school that has around 400 students. So, kind of before I came here, the closest analogy in my mind was Hogwarts. It's got some similarities, a lot of differences, but some similarities.
No robes.
Yeah, no robes, but that's okay. So all the students, as ninth graders, have an evolutionary biology class, and part of that evolutionary biology class is a 1 month section just on paleontology and what it tells us about evidence for evolution. What we see in the fossil record. The history, the basic history of the Earth, and that. So all the students start with that. Some students then, as 10th or 11th graders, they'll take a more advanced paleontology class, a little more in depth, learn more about the fossil record, learn how to read the scientific literature, and then students that want to continue on can do original research with us. And that was one of the things that really drew me to the museum in the first place, is the ability to do original research projects, maybe sometimes describing new species or describing really cool fossils that have never been seen before. And that's working, with me and then in collaboration with some of the older students at the school. So we get to do that, this whole, section of classes. But also we do summer field trips with them. We go out into the field and actually collect fossils, and all these other things. Then, of course, there's a big volunteer program we have, which Gabe can talk to.
Yeah, I handle more of the informal side of things. So all students have the opportunity to work in the museum and the after-school museum science program. Mm-hmm. All basically after school, after the class is done, they come to the museum, and we get to teach them what it's like to work in a museum, whether that's curating, preparing, labeling specimens, helping with exhibits. Sometimes they even get to help with our really cool events at the museum. And students during the summer also get an opportunity to volunteer here. So it's a lot of really cool, unique opportunities to work in a museum that, a lot of people don't have. And it's just something really fun to get to see kids get excited about putting things into a database or painting labels on specimens,
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember you mentioned when we visited that if they wanted to, they could basically experience every aspect of working or running a museum in some capacity.
It's true. There's some students who, they're not more into the academic side of things. They just want to do the after school. But there are those really great students who come through and they do the research program with Andy, and then they come in after school and stay longer to do the museum science side of things. So there's a lot of passion here with a lot of the students. I know for not very many, but there are the few students who come here specifically for the paleontology opportunities.
Yeah, nice. And I remember you mentioned that a lot of them don't end up doing paleontology as adults, obviously, because there aren't like 500 new paleontologists cranking out every year from just one high school. Well, I guess it would be only like 120. But it's really helpful for a lot of them, and they recognize kind of some of these basic science principles that they get introduced to through paleontology, and that's really great.
Yeah, I think that you've hit the nail on the head. Is it's not about creating paleontologists, and in fact, that's kind of my nightmare scenario. I love paleontology, and I'll absolutely encourage people that want to go into the field. But I think a real value of paleontology, not the only value, but a value, is it's a pretty accessible way to see how science works and to see how museums work. So if the students come out of the program, no matter how much or how little they've done with it, and at least they understand, like this stuff that I read in a textbook, there's actually a scientist somewhere who dug up a fossil and worked with collections people and preparators and outreach specialists to bring that science to the public, and they can understand that, wow, I'm a scientist, I can do science too. We really want them to understand science and the process of science, even if they don't even go into science or a science related field, if they go into business or something like that. Mm-hmm. I guess ideally if I could choose any field for them to go into, it's like, guys, go out into business and become wildly successful billionaires, and then build up our endowment here at the museum. Money. Paleontologists aren't usually as capable of donating as much, but I love all of our students anyhow. So
that's good. And then, where are some of the trips that you take them?
We do a lot of trips domestically, so especially Southern California, out through the Barstow Formation, working under permit from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, into Southern Utah and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, but also up into Montana. We've had projects in the Hell Creek Formation, the Renova Formation, which is a Cenozoic rock layer. So kind of all over. And we'll occasionally they're more on the tourist paleo side of things, but we'll do trips overseas with students or alumni. But we've been places like China, Mongolia, Madagascar. That's more of less about, really doing our own science and, maybe collaborating with the research team there or seeing some of the cool fossils from those parts of the world.
Awesome.
Yeah, when we first heard that, I think that's when Garrett and I kind of looked at each other like, oh, we wish we knew about this school when we were...
Yeah, I don't think my parents could have afforded it, though.
Well, no, but... So just talking a little bit about the museum, because Gabe, you gave us this excellent tour, but it'd be nice for our listeners to hear about kind of how the museum's set up.
Yeah, sure. So the museum, as it is now, is really great because when it was being rebuilt from the original format that it had with Ray Alf, we got to create it in a way that was really educational and really accessible. So what it is when you walk in through the front doors of the Alf Museum, you kind of start at the beginning of everything, at the beginning of the universe, and you follow that through because the museum is a giant circle and it's one big timeline. So as you go through the museum, you enter through the different periods of time and you learn about how things have changed, how things have evolved through time. You start in the Paleozoic and learn about some of the very first organisms. Then you move to our, the favorite section of most guests is the dinosaur section, where you see some really cool dinosaurs like our Allosaurus that's, open to the middle of the display of the museum. Some amazing fossil finds, like real fossils that are on display that were found by some of our students. And you go out towards, from there, the Cenozoic. And then we have downstairs is our Hall of Footprints. The Alf Museum has like one of the largest collection of fossil trackways in the United States. And when I say largest, I don't mean the amount. Some of our trackways are just huge, like tons of rock downstairs. And, they're amazing collections. And
yeah, you've got that spider trackway, right?
Yeah, Octopod Ichthys raymondi. It's a really cool track.
Yeah, that one's great.
Yeah. So it's a really cool museum because, like I said, it's 2 stories, but we pack a lot in here. For the amount for the size of our museum. And it's a really, I think, even though I work here, I think it's a really well done museum in the way that people can guide themselves through it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's kind of shocking if you were going through that museum to think that it was basically like a high school property. You know what I mean? Like, because I've been in a high school that had a planetarium before, and it was like the most simple planetarium I've ever seen. But this museum is like really, really nice. It's got, really high-end stuff, and you've got lots of what people would term as real fossils, not replicas of things. And you've got that baby Louie out on display, which is a really significant find, and all that kind of stuff. Is it baby Louie?
It's Joe.
Oh, it's baby Joe. Wrong dude name.
Another dead baby dinosaur.
Yeah, that's right. Wrong baby.
Well, it was a baby.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's really cool.
What's cool about our exhibits too, especially in downstairs, is we incorporate not just the facts about the dinosaur or the specimens, but we talk a lot about the science that goes into finding it and describing it, and even the museum side of things downstairs. So it's a really cool way for people to just learn about the entire process, from fossilization to finding in the field to the research to displaying it on the museum.
Mm-hmm.
You can really get the whole experience in, our 2 floors here.
Yeah. And you've also got some cool technology stuff going on, like the augmented reality.
Yeah. Like I said, our museum's small. We only have 2 floors. We don't really have the budget to keep doing renovations or additions to our exhibits to make them more accessible. A lot of our guests who come to the museum are usually people who speak English as a second language. We do tours for differently abled people, whether they're visually impaired or hearing impaired. So we've been trying to find ways to make the museum more inclusive for them, because a lot of times when you have museums, our exhibits are very much visual based, or they're like touch displays or something where, you have to be able to see or hear. But we have people who come here who can't participate in that way. And like for me, I have family who are, we're from the Philippines, so they speak English as their second language, so it's hard for them to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to find a way for them to be a part of the museum experience instead of having to use like a booklet or something. So what I'm trying to do right now is incorporate augmented reality in a way that people can use their tablets or their phone and hold it up to our museum displays. And then it'll either like translate the text into Spanish or Chinese. It'll start playing a video, an animation with subtitles. It'll play an audio dictation so that people who are visually impaired can have a tactile experience and feel the fossil and be able to get a mental image of whatever they're feeling so they can, kind of get a picture of the fossil. So really, the Augmented Reality project is just a way to make our museum much more inclusive and accessible to everybody, and really go along with what Andy was saying and make sure that, the science is kind of open to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, augmented reality is awesome. I think that's the first museum we went to where you could use your own device to do it. There were some that kind of have tablets built in, and in like a very limited way, you could point at like one or two things.
Yeah, like the Philip Curry Museum.
Yeah, which was cool too. I mean, augmented reality is always cool, but if you can use your own device, I think people might be a little more likely to use it all over the place rather than kind of going from tablet to tablet kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's the other advantage, is for a museum. I mean, most museums, particularly small museums, we don't have the budget to update the technology every, 2 years or even necessarily every 5 years. So if we can, have the option where something that for most visitors who will likely have that device, in their pocket already, it's available. And then, of course, making sure that we have a couple, devices that people can use or borrow, because we do recognize not everyone has them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, having stuff, more in the, more out there in the cloud, I think is definitely, better for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because it's hard to buy, a whole huge set of iPads every 2 years or whatever you'd have to do otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. And the thing about this project too is it's helpful on our side of things because we don't have to build new exhibits. We just add to something that's already there, and it's not physically there. You know what I mean? It's an overlay using augmented reality, and we can change it that morning. Let's say, Andy publishes a new paper on Diabloceratops, and we have to change something on the text. We can go up and, I can change it on the augmented reality like that morning, and it's ready to go in like 5 minutes, and it's ready. If some new paper comes out, I can create a new video on some new exhibit in a couple of days and have that ready to go for people to keep up with all the latest information. And also, it's a free program to use. What I'm using HP Reveal, and it's free for users, and it's great because the app is free. It's free to upload things. It's really easy to use.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to make sure there's a way for no museum to have an excuse now to not try to at least experiment with inclusivity and accessible design.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Andy, we have a few dinosaur questions, of course. But since you study ceratopsians, and we met John Scannella a couple years back, and he said to talk to you at some point because we were talking to him about the Torosaurus Triceratops debate.
For me now. John set this up.
Yeah, you can blame him.
Before his vengeance would come. I actually, John and I get along quite well, which is why I can joke about such things.
Yeah.
I only joke about researchers I like. Anyhow.
But so our listeners know a little bit about that debate and how it still is. Would you say it's still hotly contested? Is it still kind of a big issue?
I'd say so. I mean, the Museum of the Rockies still has a display where it's like, these are the growth stages of Triceratops. And the last one is a skull that most people would consider a Torosaurus.
Most people, that's the key word.
Yeah, most people.
No, I mean, I think I would say it's disputed still, or at least there's not a complete consensus on it. It's not really disputed though, in that like there just hasn't been a lot of new stuff done on it lately. Like I think basically everyone that's going to say something on it, has said their piece. Now it's just kind of, marking time, waiting for that one fossil that's going to settle it, definitively one way or the other. That really being a juvenile Torosaurus that everyone agrees is a juvenile Torosaurus, or good histology on limb bones for associated skulls with Triceratops, Torosaurus, etc.
Yeah, because basically the idea is either Torosaurus is just an old Triceratops or it's not. And there are juvenile Torosaurus and there are juvenile Triceratops as well. And yeah.
I think basically, things I've said, several years ago or, many years ago now, like 5 years ago in some cases, I think there are things that are very likely juvenile or at least young Torosaurus, and some of the transformations that would have had to have happened in the skull to make a Triceratops grow up into a Torosaurus. I think they're just so outside the norm of what we know about horned dinosaur growth that it just doesn't, doesn't really, fit in the end. And I think, I think where some people, or some at least people that are more on like the casual side of things, say, well, he disputes, Torosaurus being the same thing as Triceratops. That must mean like, that every, he disputes all this stuff about dinosaur growth and ontogeny. And, that's not really the case either. I think it's really a case of like, well, yeah, I mean, things obviously changed as they grew. We know that Triceratops changed a lot from when it was little, the small skull that they have up at Berkeley to, what we think of as classic Triceratops. I just think, the weight of the evidence doesn't really fit, with Torosaurus being kind of like the ultimate end old Triceratops.
Yeah. Can you remind me, is it that Triceratops frill has no holes and then the Torosaurus has holes?
Yep, that's part of it. And the other thing, and one of the pieces of evidence that I think is most compelling for them being separate, and a big difference if you're a Triceratops or Torosaurus nerd, is the number of little like spiky bone things, to use technical terminology, on the edge of the frill. They're called epiparietals or episquamosals or epiossifications, meaning they're the bones that sit on the edge of the frill. It seems to be the case for horned dinosaurs in general, and this seems to be the case for things that people agree are Triceratops, is they don't change the number of those little sticky-on-y things on the edge of the frill as they grow up. So if you look at the, for instance, that tiny little Berkeley skull, the skull at UC Berkeley that, you can basically hold in one hand, it has as many little bumpy things or places for little bumpy things on the edge of its frill as does a skull that's like, 10 times its size or 5 times its size. And that's what we see in other horned dinosaurs too, things like Centrosaurus. The number of spiky things on the edge of a frill of a small Centrosaurus are the same as what we see in something that's at full size. Torosaurus, though, has like roughly twice the number of little spiky things on its frill. And so what that would suggest was that if Torosaurus is Triceratops, then Triceratops would start out as a tiny animal, grow up to something with a skull 6 or 7 feet long, and keep the same number of little spiky things on the edge of its frill all through that. But then, like for the last 2 feet of skull growth, it's all of a sudden just going to add a whole bunch of extra bones on the edge of its frill.
And grow holes.
I mean, I could see like, the growing holes thing is something that seems plausible, but, the addition of all those little extra bones on the frill just doesn't fit with what other horned dinosaurs do. Doesn't mean it's not it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's just a little inconsistent with what we know otherwise.
Yep.
Yeah. So since you've done a lot of research on ceratopsians and you've named, like I know you described Aquillops, which is that really cute little dinosaur, and have all these great papers out. What's the most exciting thing to you that you've discovered in your research?
Baby Joe, maybe. Did you discover Baby Joe?
I was there when it was found. I actually told the student who found it it wasn't worth looking at. That's like, a little embarrassing. We all have those moments. Yeah, when we found that, I was out prospecting with one of our high school students, and he saw this bone sticking out under a rock. And usually when you're out looking for dinosaurs, most of what you find isn't necessarily worth excavating or worth collecting. It might be bone scraps or things like that, little non-diagnostic pieces of bones. Doesn't mean they have no scientific importance, but in terms of a museum, you can't necessarily, for many purposes, pick up every little scrap of bone on the ground, because if you have like 1,000 or 1,000,000 little pieces of unidentifiable dinosaur bone, you're going to run out of space and time and money to really take care of it. So when he first found this piece of bone, it looked like, it was kind of covered in rock, and I looked up at it and I was like, oh, that just looks like a little piece of rib fragment or something like that, which is always like the default identification for that. And then as we, got looking at the site a little more, it turned out it was, I guess it actually is a nearly complete dinosaur skeleton. Oops. Yeah, so that happened. So that was a really cool find. Probably the thing that I've personally found Like the fossil that I thought was, that was kind of cool was finding the brain case that became the holotype for a sauropod dinosaur called Vahini, which is from Madagascar. When I was a grad student, I did a number of field seasons over there with Stony Brook University and the University of Antananarivo. And I was walking along one day. We were sort of revisiting these old sites where people had found fossils before. And as I'm walking along, I see this little like knob of bone sticking up out of the ground, kind of on its own little pedestal. And I look down at it. I'm like, oh, that kind of looks like a brain case of something. And I'm not a brain caseologist, so I didn't know exactly what kind of brain case it was. But brain cases are cool because they're often, they're very diagnostic to the kind of animal. And I thought, oh, it looks like some sort of archosaur. It's not a theropod. Maybe it's a crocodilian, or maybe it's a sauropod. So we collected it, we jacketed it up very carefully. And then a year or 2 or 3 later in the prep lab, turned out that's like, oh, wow, this is the brain case for this species of sauropod that we haven't had sufficient, stuff to name previously, and it's going to be the type specimen, or this is the specimen that we're going to hang that name on.
Nice.
So that was kind of cool because it's like, I technically discovered a new species of dinosaur, and that's like, that's a childhood dream right there.
Yeah.
So, finding the holotype for something is really kind of cool, and that's it's an achievement unlocked in that case.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and you got there early too, if you're still a grad student at the time.
Yeah, way back in the day. So yeah, it's pretty fun. I think that's one of the really fun things, but also one of the real privileges is being able to do that. Because I recognize there's paleontologists that might spend their whole career and never get that experience. So I'm pretty grateful for that.
Yeah. So kind of going into the SciComm sort of stuff, Andy, you're the PLOS Paleo Community Editor. Can you tell us a little bit about the paleo community and then I guess what it means to be an editor?
Yeah, so I'm one of 3 editors with John Tennant and Sarah Gibson. So we all manage that. So basically the paleo community is first and foremost a website, so hosted at PLOS Blogs. And the intention with that is really to advocate for and highlight open science and open access science within paleontology. So one of the things, for anyone who's ever visited the website, we have a weekly Fossil Friday post, and that's something that, that's really Sarah Gibson's, brainchild and something that she's really the main person behind that, where we sum up all the open access articles in paleontology that were published that week and point out towards where maybe there's cool news articles or blog posts or events related to paleontology. So that's part of what we do. Part of what we do also is doing blog posts on events. We have our Twitter feed and stuff like that to just kind of make a location and a resource for paleontologists or those who are interested in paleontology to learn more about the field. And then the other thing that my favorite annual event is we do our top 10 open access species of the year for paleontology. So It started off, I think, originally just as like vertebrate fossils and stuff, and now it's sort of ballooned into like looking across paleontology in general. We had this year it was exciting. It wasn't just a dinosaur. In number 1 slot, it was a fish, which was kind of cool, a prehistoric trumpet fish.
It's kind of cool.
It was cool. It was a really great illustration.
And then in the top 5 slots, we had the oldest fossil mushroom. So it's and then there was a lot of dinosaurs too. But it's kind of cool to see that it's not just dinosaurs that are getting all this press or all this attention or all this devotion for making their research more accessible. But there's other facets of paleontology that are out there. And I think it's a good opportunity to remind folks, that paleontology is more than dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs. I'm not right now talking on a podcast with the word dino in the title. But, it's fossils are just cool in general. And so, one of the things that I think we try and promote and you often succeed with the PLOS Paleo community is, the idea of, all the cool fossils that are out there. And then, it's, further thinking about it, the fact that we want to make these fossils as accessible to everyone, whether that's in the publication format or the data availability and all that. So that's what PLOS Paleo is all about.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that list.
And open access in general.
Yeah. Yeah, we look forward to it.
Cool.
And Gabe, I know you have a ton of projects because you're this amazing science communicator. And actually, I think we didn't know for a while that you were a collections manager at the Alf Museum because we just knew you from all your other projects.
No, I guess that's cool though.
So let's see, where to start? You're the co-founder of Cosplay for Science.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Sure. Cosplay for Science. That's been a fun experiment. I guess that started here at the Alf Museum because last year we had our very first Making Monsters event. That's our Discovery Day where we talk about how paleontology can influence things in pop culture like video games and like TV shows and stuff. And, I'm a huge nerd. I've played Pokemon since I was 10 and I've known all the fossil Pokemon since then. And, I wanted to do something fun with the kids. And so what I did is I took all the fossils out that had an equivalent form in the Pokemon world. And I dressed up as Professor Oak. And I did the whole voice for all the kids when they came up. And I'd be like, "Hello, young trainer. You want to learn about fossil Pokemon?" And so they came and I just saw how much fun they had and how engaged they got. We're like, "Oh my God, Professor Oak is talking to us about Pokemon paleontology." And I had a blast because, I turned into a little kid, getting to talk with all these people who just loved it. And it was really fun. And that kind of started things where I was like, oh, this could be something interesting to kind of do where you combine people's nerdiness and love of pop culture with science. And then it really came into being this year when we partnered with the Western Science Center, particularly Brittany Stoneberg, their marketing person there. She's a giant nerd. We're very good friends. And we partnered together to get a booth at this small Comic-Con called NerdBotCon here in Pasadena. And we decided that if we're going to do it, we're going to be at a con. We're both nerdy. We love cosplay to begin with. Let's dress up, right? So for the Comic-Con, we dressed up as all the characters from Jurassic Park. I was Dr. Grant. Brittany was Dr. Sattler. We had every character you could imagine with all the dinosaurs and fossils, and just to get people interested. And people walked up and were like, "Oh my God, you guys are from Jurassic Park." And like, "Yeah, we have real fossils too." And you see their jaws hit the floor. It was just so much fun. And just seeing how engaged people got and how interested they got in not just learning about this Jurassic Park, but the science behind it all really got things going. And so it became official after that. Our friend Michelle Barboza from University of Florida and also the founder of the Femmes of STEM podcast joined us because she's a giant nerd too. And then another one of our friends, my best friend Isaac Magallanes, who is also at University of Florida and studies marine mammals and education there, joined us because he's a nerd. So we're just a bunch of nerds who found a reason to cosplay, quote, professionally, while also talking about paleontology. And it's been really fun. We've gotten a lot of really cool people following us on Instagram and on Twitter and people wanting to do cosplays with us. We've had a few other scientists send us their cosplays that they've done and talk about the science behind that. So, this is their first year doing this kind of project, and we're hoping it gets bigger and a really cool way to make science more approachable, accessible, and relatable. So yeah, we have another con coming up in May. That's Comic-Con Revolution Ontario. And we're doing a panel actually about the evolution of dinosaurs through pop culture. We're talking about how they've changed in cinema and TV and like video games. Andy will actually be a panelist on that with a bunch of other paleontologists from the area.
Nice.
We're going to be at WonderCon. So we have a lot of really cool things planned for Cosplay for Science. So yeah, if you want to follow along, you can check us out on Instagram. Shameless plug.
Yeah, go for it. At Cosplay for Science?
Yeah, Cosplay for Science. We're on Instagram and Twitter.
Really what it is Gabe wanted to have a situation where he can be the only paleontologist in the world who's paid to carry around a lightsaber.
It's true.
It's like the best scam ever.
I get paid to do it, and it's great. Brittany and I are planning to do a geology of Star Wars video one day where we're dressed up as Padawans from the Jedi archives, and we're tasked with collecting geological samples from Tatooine to record previous fluvial systems. And so we're going to talk about geological process and sedimentary structures while we're out in Mojave Desert, pretending we're on Tatooine. And
yeah, that's awesome. Plus, it makes it in a way more accessible for kids, especially if they're fans of Star Wars.
Yeah.
Younglings.
Not younglings.
Didn't they use a dinosaur skeleton in the Tatooine set in Africa? Wasn't that one of your dinosaur things. It was like a sauropod or something.
Yeah.
And there have been a number of the different ship designs that are at least one I know of that were based on dinosaur vertebrae and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The ship designs.
Yeah, it's the Imperial Cruiser.
What?
Oh, cool.
I had no idea.
It's one with the wings that fold up like that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool like monsters in the background. They're all based off of real dinosaurs. Terrell Whitlatch, who's the concept artist for the episode 1, she did this amazing book called The Wildlife of Star Wars, where she drew a natural history book from the perspective of being in the world of Star Wars. And if you look at a lot of the animals she drew, she said she was influenced by paleontology and real animals and really shaped them to fit the world. And so it's really cool to have that and use it as a starting point to talk about not just paleontology, but natural history, science, biology, anything you can think of. And that's what Cosplay for Science is. It's not just paleontology. It's just trying to get people interested in science and see science and where they normally wouldn't, and hopefully get them to think about science more often.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like Andy said, I got to use a lightsaber.
Yep, that's pretty fun. And you've also got the Paleontology Education Facebook group, which last I checked, you've got over 1,000 members.
Yeah, that blew up fast. And that is actually the brainchild of Tara Lepore. She is another paleontologist here at the Alf Museum and the Webb Schools. She teaches environmental science here. And she is, a long-time paleontology educator and science communicator. And she wanted to create something where paleontologists, educators, science communicators, and people just interested in general could come together as a community to share ideas, get feedback, talk about fun new ways to educate paleontology. And Tara, Ashley, Paul, and then Ashley Morehart had actually a paleontology education workshop at SVP last year that came about from the website. So we're hoping to do a lot more with that, maybe podcast or YouTube video tutorials in the future. It's just something that's really cool, and a really cool community of people that's becoming more prominent within the paleontology community itself.
Yeah, that's great. So this is a little bit different, but I saw pictures on your Instagrams recently for Nerd Night LA.
Oh, yes.
That was Andy.
Yeah, that was me. Well, Instagram, I was on it.
Yeah, that was my picture.
So what did you talk about, Andy?
Oh, so I talked, the title of my talk was The Dinosaur in My Beer. And the idea with this, and this is something I've been pursuing in a couple different venues, is looking at the connections between beer, and I'm someone who's a home brewer. I make my own beer. I enjoy
so good.
I enjoy drinking beer responsibly, but I also really, really, really enjoy finding the connections between the world of natural history and of paleontology and of science in general with beer. So and this is an area that's really unexplored in the world of beer and beer research and beer writing. Typically if someone talks about the history of beer, they start somewhere back in the Middle East when some people figured out a way to ferment some grains, and then they talk about, well, in the Middle Ages you add hops to beer, and then it culminates in the American craft brewer today. And you're like, that's I guess that's part of the story, but it leaves out, the other 4.6 billion years of history. So I really like to think about, and I like to get other people thinking about, that bigger story behind not just beer, but behind anything in our lives. So at the talk, I specifically, for purposes of time, just looked at the history of the hop plant, which is what gives beer its bitterness and some flavor and aroma characteristics, which we can have hop plants that might be as old as the time of Triceratops. But, other things that I've explored with that have been, things like, the way that the development of the Pilsner beer style, at least indirectly, was related to the discovery of Archaeopteryx. There's all sorts of connections you can find. The connection, just to, for the short version of that, is that Archaeopteryx and many of the Archaeopteryx fossils and a lot of pterosaur fossils we know were discovered basically as an industrial byproduct. The Solnhofen limestone, where they come from, Some of those layers of the limestone were used in lithography, which is basically taking the stones and using them as a type of printing plate for art prints or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
The rock of the Solnhofen limestone has also been used as a building material, like roofing tiles, as a sculpting medium. But then for the purposes of beer, Solnhofen limestone traditionally turned out to be really good for making the floors of malting houses. So basically the buildings where they're sprouting the barley or other grains and germinating them and then heating them up to get them prepared for brewing of beer. So you basically, back in the 19th century and the 18th century, you have these quarries that are operating at top capacity, not just for printing plates and stuff like that, but also to make these malt house floors. And as you're doing that, you're getting all this, it's basically bycatch, all these fossils that turn up. So I like to think that that Archaeopteryx, or at least some of the Archaeopteryx fossils, were probably at least indirectly, or maybe even directly in some cases, a result of these construction of those malt houses. Those nice Solnhofen limestone floored malt houses. Some of them are still in use.
Wow.
In Europe, and I've actually made a beer that used barley that was malted on Solnhofen limestone. So this is like down the geekiest corner of the geekiest rabbit hole, But one of the things that I just love is finding these kinds of connections, and thinking about the fact that no matter what it is, whether it's beer, whether it's food, whether it's technology, there's connections with everything, and if you really know where to look. The history of everything is much deeper than just the last couple thousand years of recorded human history.
Mm-hmm.
The history goes back, to the formation of our planet and, before that even. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, leave it to a paleontologist to look into the millions of years of history rather than just like a couple hundred.
Yeah.
The more you know.
Yeah. So for our listeners who might want to learn about both of you and your work, where's the best place to find out more, and if they wanted to get involved in any of your projects?
So for our museum, alfmuseum.org is our official museum website. There's @Alf Museum as our Twitter feed. There's @Alf Paleo as our Instagram. There's the Facebook page and all that. So that's kind of the best place to find out just about what we're doing as a museum. For my personal stuff, there's the PLOS Paleo website. If you just search PLOS Paleo Community, you'll find that. For my beer and brewing and beer communication activities, it's Andy Brews, ANDYBREWS.com. Yep. And then of course my personal Twitter @AndyFarke is the other place where I spew forth science communication and science and beer and all that kind of stuff.
And you'll just see me retweeting it pretty fast. Yeah, you can find me personal. I'm @Paleo Paradox on Twitter and Instagram. I'm usually there. I post something at least every hour. For Cosplay for Science, again, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter. Paleontology Education, you can find that on Facebook. It's a Facebook group. Just really quick, if you want to join, make sure you fill out the questions, because there's a lot of people try to join, don't fill out the questions, and we won't let them in. So yeah, make sure you fill those out. And yeah, I'm very much, all of us at the museum are pretty active on social media. So if you find one of us, you'll find everything else pretty fast.
And I would also encourage, for those who are in the Los Angeles area or happen to be going through the Los Angeles area, to stop by the museum, either on our regular hours, which are listed on our various websites, or for one of our discovery days at the museum, where we have special events, the Making Monsters event. We have
our next one is the Women of Paleontology event. That's on February 10th, February 10th. It's a Saturday. And we're having a lot of our local paleontologists, our friends and guests, come to the museum who are women to come and speak about their research, their experiences in the field, and really do more, like I said, for representation and inclusivity. It's going to be really cool. We have some really great guests coming to talk about some really cool research.
Yeah, another area where the Los Angeles community is just a phenomenal place to be a paleontologist. There's so many great people.
It's true.
That's great.
Yeah, I was surprised. Well, like happily surprised when we were visiting, and then we heard about all these events that seem to be happening all the time.
Yeah, it's a nice place to be a paleontologist.
It is. I'm very lucky that I was born and raised here and get a chance to stay here as a paleontologist.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been great chatting with you both.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thanks so much, Andy and Gabe. We really enjoyed talking to you. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Gojirasaurus, which was a request from TRES4 via YouTube, so thanks. It was a coelophysoid that lived in the Triassic in what is now New Mexico, and its name means Godzilla lizard. It was named after Gojira, which is the Japanese name for Godzilla, and Gojira is a combination of the Japanese words for gorilla, Gojira, and whale, Gojira.
So it's a portmanteau.
Yep. And there is also a Godzillasaurus in the Heisei era of Godzilla films, and that's a political period of Japan. And Godzillasaurus is fictional.
So it's just a character in the Godzilla films.
Yes. The type species of Gojirasaurus is Gojirasaurus quayi, and quayi refers to Quay County, New Mexico, where the holotype was found. And it was found in the Cooper Canyon Formation in 1981, and it was described in 1997 by Kenneth Carpenter. Gojirasaurus may be a dubious genus, though. Fossils of the first specimen found include a serrated tooth, some ribs, vertebrae, chevron, right pubis, left tibia, and metatarsal. However, in 2007, Nesbitt and others found that the vertebrae were actually of Shuvasaurus, and the pubis and tibia came from another coelophysoid. It was too large to be Coelophysis, so it was some other coelophysoid, and that's what made Gojirasaurus a dubious genus. On the other hand, Nesbitt and others also said that the tibia was what distinguished Gojirasaurus as its own genus, because that showed that Gojirasaurus was more robust than Coelophysis. In 2012, Mortimer said that the more robust tibia may just be size-related, though, and not actually a distinguishing feature. There was another specimen referred to Gojirasaurus in 1994, but it was only a pubis. Adrian Hunt described the pubis in an unpublished thesis and named it Revultoraptor lucasi, but it's now considered to be a nomum nudum. As a coelophysoid, Gojirasaurus was bipedal, terrestrial, and carnivorous, and it was one of the largest carnivores from the Triassic. It was about 18 feet or 5.5 meters long and estimated to weigh 330 to 440 pounds or 150 to 200 kilograms. Kenneth Carpenter thought that the holotype was of a juvenile, so maybe it grew bigger. The specimen is now in the University of Colorado Museum in Boulder, Colorado in their collections.
And our fun fact of the day is that radar is an acronym for radio detection and ranging, whereas LiDAR is just a portmanteau of light and radar. And portmanteaus, like Godzilla or Gojira, are when you take basically the front half of one word and the back half of another word and you smash them together, like Brangelina, the couple.
That's the example you go for.
Most people know about that one, right? That was like the first celebrity couple to have that like mashed together name.
Oh, maybe.
I think it was. So, yeah, it's interesting because LiDAR is a portmanteau of an acronym, and sometimes people make a backronym, which is an acronym created after the fact, and they make LiDAR light detection and ranging, but that's not actually what it stands for. When we were talking earlier about LiDAR, the Arkansas track site that they measured using LiDAR used it for a very good reason. It had recently rained, which means that all of the footprints were full of water. So you couldn't do photogrammetry because obviously if you're taking pictures of it, you're just taking pictures of puddles and you won't see all the way to the bottom. And you also can't do radar. No one really uses radar, but I don't think structured light would work either because it reflects off the surface of the water. But using LiDAR and their green laser light, it went through the water and measured down to the bottom of the footprints, even when they were full of water from the rain. So it worked like magic.
All right.
Yeah, good time to use LiDAR.
When you need magic.
Yes, like seeing through water. Probably muddy, gross water.
And on that note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes. You can also join our growing community on Patreon at patreon.com/iknowdino. Thanks again, and until next time.
Thank you for listening to I Know Dino. If you have any questions or comments about dinosaurs, we'd like to hear from you at plesiosaur@iknowdino.com. And for more information on dinosaurs, go to iknowdino.com or follow us on Google, Facebook, Tumblr, or Twitter at I Know Dino.